Okay, so get ready because we're diving deep today into a story that's really going to make you think about justice and doubt and advocacy. It's the story of the West Memphis Three.
Yeah, this case, it really sticks with you, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, you've got these three teenagers convicted of murdering three 8-year-old boys back in 1993. But did they actually do it?
Right, that's the big question, isn't it? And the one we're going to try to answer today using this podcast episode as our guide.
So to set the scene, it's 1993 in West Memphis, Arkansas. Three little boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Chris Byers, disappear.
And then their bodies are found in a drainage ditch. It's awful they've been brutally murdered.
It's unimaginable, and the community was understandably terrified.
Oh, yeah, that kind of fear. It can really grip a town, especially a small town like West Memphis.
Absolutely. And they needed answers. They needed someone to blame.
And that's where Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Misskelley Jr. come in.
Three teenagers who became the focus of the investigation.
The police zeroed in on them pretty quickly, and it's hard not to see the influence of the satanic panic that was sweeping the country at the time.
Oh, the satanic panic. So that's why they became suspects, because of this panic.
Well, it played a part for sure. Damien was into heavy metal music, wore black clothes, dabbled in the occult.
Oh, that fits the stereotype people had in their minds about satanic cult.
Exactly. And suddenly, those seemingly harmless teenage interests, they became suspicious.
So are you saying that the investigation itself might have been biased from the start?
It's a possibility. The podcast we're looking at today points out how this fear of satanic cults really shaped the investigation.
How so?
Well, for example, the prosecution brought in a so-called satanic cult expert, Dale Griffith.
And what were his credentials?
Questionable, to say the least.
Okay, that doesn't sound good.
But his testimony, it really fueled the narrative that the murders were part of some satanic ritual.
Wait, so this expert, did you have any actual evidence to support his claims?
Not really, but in the context of the satanic panic, his words carried weight. They influenced public opinion and maybe even the jury's perception of the defendants.
It's kind of scary how societal anxieties can seep into the justice system like that.
It is, and sometimes with devastating consequences, as we see in this case.
So we've got a community gripped by fear, a rush to judgment, and now this questionable expert testimony. What happened next?
Well, the police needed confession, and they got one, but from a very unlikely source, Jesse Misskelley Jr., the youngest of the three.
Right, he was only 17 at the time.
And Jesse had a low IQ and was interrogated for hours without a lawyer present. He eventually confessed, but his defense attorneys argued that the confession was coerced.
Coerced, meaning?
Meaning the police fed him details of the crime and manipulated him into saying what they wanted to hear.
That's terrifying. What about Damien and Jason? Did they confess?
No, they maintained their innocence throughout the entire ordeal. But the prosecution had their so-called expert witness, the coerced confession from Jesse and two teenage girls who claimed to have overheard Damien admitting to the murders.
So these girls, they were eyewitnesses.
They claimed to be, but their testimonies were shaky at best. They changed their stories multiple times, and there were questions about whether they were pressured by investigators as well. It really makes you wonder about the reliability of eyewitness testimony in general, doesn't it?
It does, especially in a case with so much pressure to find the culprits.
Right, and remember that blood sample we talked about? The one collected from the man covered in blood and mud at the Bojangles?
Yeah, whatever happened with that?
They lost it.
Are you serious?
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
Hmm.
A major blunder that fueled even more suspicions about how the investigation was handled.
Wow, so much for a fair trial. What were the verdicts?
Well, Jesse Misskelley Jr., he was tried, first convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. A few weeks later, Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin went on trial together, and the atmosphere surrounding their trial was incredibly hostile. The podcast describes Damien being subjected to threats and insults as he entered the courtroom.
Oh my gosh, can you imagine?
It's hard to believe they could even get a fair trial in that kind of environment.
Right, the pressure to convict must have been immense.
It was, and Damien, he actually took the stand in his own defense.
Really?
Yeah, but his demeanor, which was sometimes inappropriate, might have actually hurt his case.
Oh, how so?
Well, he was sarcastic and defiant at times, which didn't play well with the jury. They might have seen it as arrogance or a lack of remorse, even though his lawyers argued it was just a coping mechanism for a scared young man facing a potential death sentence.
That's heartbreaking. And Jason, what about him?
Jason refused to testify even when he was offered a plea deal that would have significantly reduced his sentence.
He must have felt strongly about his innocence.
He did. He felt it was wrong to plead guilty to something he didn't do, and he didn't want to implicate Damien either.
This says a lot about his character, even under such extreme pressure.
Absolutely. But despite their pleas of innocence, both Damien and Jason were found guilty. Jason was sentenced to life in prison, and Damien, because he was painted as the ringleader of this supposed satanic cult, he received the death penalty.
So 3 teenagers are convicted on what sounds like flimsy evidence fueled by public fear and a desperate need to find someone to blame. It's a nightmare scenario. But the story doesn't end there, does it?
Not at all. In fact, you could say this is where the story really begins. 2 years later, the documentary Paradise Lost is released.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that one.
And it brings national attention to the case, raising serious doubts about the convictions.
What did the documentary focus on?
It examines the evidence, exposes the flaws in the investigation, highlights the lack of concrete evidence linking the 3 to the crime. It really opened people's eyes.
That documentary was huge. I remember hearing about it. It really shifted public opinion, didn't it?
It did. Suddenly, people who had been quick to condemn the West Memphis Three started to question the verdict. And the film also helped bring in new experts who challenged the prosecution's case.
Oh, cool.
Well, forensic pathologists, for example. They start to question whether the boys' deaths were even the result of a satanic ritual.
Really?
Yeah. They suggested that some of the injuries could have been caused by animal predation. And then there was the DNA evidence. Remember that hair found at the crime scene?
Uh-huh.
It was finally tested, and the results excluded the West Memphis Three.
Okay, so that's huge. The DNA evidence doesn't match. Case closed, right?
Well, not so fast. Here's where it gets really interesting. The DNA actually matched Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of one of the murdered boys, Stevie Branch.
Well, hold on. So now we have a new suspect, someone who was never even considered during the initial investigation. This changes everything.
It does. And to make things even more suspicious, 2 of Hobbs's former neighbors came forward claiming they had seen him with the 3 boys on the day they disappeared.
Did he deny it?
Hobbs vehemently denied the claims, but the DNA evidence and the eyewitness accounts were hard to ignore. It really started to look like the wrong people were behind bars.
This is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So what happened next? Did they retry Hobbs? Was the case reopened?
Well, it's not that simple. The West Memphis Three were still in prison. Remember, Damien was still on death row.
Right, of course.
So while this new evidence raised serious questions about Hobbs, their immediate focus was getting Damien, Jason, and Jesse out of prison.
So how did they do that? With all this new evidence, you'd think they could easily get a new trial.
You'd think so, but the legal system is complex. Remember, they were already convicted. Overturning those convictions would be a long and difficult process. They needed a strategy that could get them out of prison quickly, and that's where Lorie Davis comes in.
Lorie Davis. Damien Echols' wife. She's been a fierce advocate for his innocence from the beginning.
Right. She started writing to Damien after seeing Paradise Lost, and they eventually fell in love and got married while he was still on death row.
Wow, what a story. But how did she help get them out of prison?
She played a crucial role in bringing the case back into the public eye and rallying support for the West Memphis Three. She worked tirelessly to raise awareness, gather new evidence, and enlist high-profile supporters like Johnny Depp.
That's incredible. But still, they needed a legal solution, right?
They did, and they came up with a controversial plan, the Alford plea. This plea allows a defendant to maintain their innocence while simultaneously pleading guilty to a crime.
Wait, that sounds like a contradiction. How does that even work?
It's a legal loophole, a way to end a case without admitting guilt. It's often used as a last resort when a defendant believes they have no chance of winning a new trial, even if they're innocent.
So they were basically forced to plead guilty to get out of prison.
Pretty much. The state agreed to the Alford plea, but there was a catch: all 3 men had to take the deal.
Did they all agree to it?
Jesse did, but Jason initially refused. He felt it was wrong to plead guilty to a crime he didn't commit.
I can understand that. It must have felt like a betrayal of their fight for justice.
Absolutely. But Jason eventually changed his mind, realizing that Damien might die on death row if they didn't take the deal. It was a heartbreaking decision, but they felt like they had no other choice.
So on August 19, 2011, after 18 years of wrongful imprisonment, the West Memphis Three walked out of prison free, but still convicted felons. What a bittersweet victory. They were free, but their names weren't cleared. The question of who actually murdered those 3 boys remained unanswered.
And the shadow of doubt still hangs over Terry Hobbs. He was never charged with any crime related to the murders, but the DNA evidence and the eyewitness accounts are disturbing, to say the least.
So we have 3 men who were wrongfully convicted, a potential suspect who has never been brought to justice, and a community that's still grappling with the trauma of those murders.
Yeah.
What a tangled web.
Yeah, it really is. It's a story that just grabs you and doesn't let go. But in this case, it wasn't just a story. It was real life with real people whose lives were shattered.
Exactly. And even though Damien, Jason, and Jesse are free now, they still carry the weight of those convictions.
Right.
They were robbed of 18 years of their lives.
Yeah.
18 years, it's hard to even comprehend. And they're still fighting to clear their names completely.
They are. And the podcast we're discussing today, it actually talks about how they all struggled to adjust to life outside of prison after so long. Imagine being thrown back into a world that had changed so much while you were gone.
It would be overwhelming, to say the least.
Damien and Lorie moved to New York City. Think about that sensory overload after years of confinement.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
And what about Jason?
Jason, he had to learn basic life skills, things most of us take for granted, like driving a car.
Wow, it's like they had to start their lives all over again. What about Jesse? Where did he end up?
Jesse enrolled in community college. It's pretty amazing to see how they've all tried to rebuild their lives after everything they went through.
It really shows their resilience.
Mhm.
But this whole case, it raises so many questions about our justice system. It makes you wonder how many other innocent people might be out there trapped in a similar nightmare.
It's a disturbing thought, and it's probably more common than we'd like to think. The West Memphis Three case, it really highlights the dangers of tunnel vision in investigations.
Right, and the influence of public pressure on prosecutors and juries.
And we can't forget about the fallibility of eyewitness testimony.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about the role of the media. The way the West Memphis Three were portrayed, especially in the early days of the investigation, it was incredibly biased.
They were practically demonized before they even had a chance to defend themselves.
And that kind of media coverage, it can have a huge impact on public opinion and even on the outcome of a trial.
It's a reminder that we should always be critical of the information we're consuming, especially when it comes to high-profile cases like this one.
We need to be aware of our own biases
Yeah.
and be willing to question the narratives that are given.
Exactly. So what can we learn from all of this? What does the West Memphis Three case tell us about the future?
Well, for one, it highlights the need for criminal justice reform.
Absolutely. We need to make sure that investigations are thorough and impartial, that evidence is handled properly, and that everyone has access to a fair trial.
Right. And we also can't underestimate the power of advocacy.
You're so right. Lorie Davis's commitment to Damien and the support of all those other people, it was instrumental in bringing attention to this case and getting those men released.
It shows that even when the system fails, there's still hope. People can make a difference, and public pressure can force change.
This case, it's a story about the dark side of our justice system, but it's also a story about hope and resilience.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in pursuing justice.
We can't just assume the system will always work. We need to be engaged, informed, and willing to speak out against injustice.
This deep dive has been a wild ride. It's been heartbreaking and infuriating, but also inspiring.
It reminds us that the pursuit of justice is an ongoing struggle, and it's a struggle we all need to be a part of.
Well said. That's it for our deep dive into the West Memphis Three. We'll be back next time with another story that will make you think, question, and hopefully inspire you to make a difference in the world.